Story 1. Back when I was in my early teens, I lived in a rural area with my parents. We had a large house off one of the main highways between two towns. It was about the same distance to each, but I went to school in the larger town, and most other stuff was there too. Even though the road was pretty busy, we had a long driveway that led to our house. It was lined with evergreen trees that were planted when the house was built, so they were all in a neat line. The whole thing seems pretty extravagant in hindsight, but at the time it was all I knew. It wasn't until later that I realized how lucky I was to grow up there. Some people would say that we were rich. One time I was home alone on a Thursday night. I don't remember where my parents were, but they wouldn't have left me alone for long. They were definitely coming home that night. When I was on the computer in my dad's office, the doorbell rang. I was surprised because it wasn't common for anyone to visit this late, especially out where we lived, where the nearest neighbor was a good half-mile away. I knew that my friends wouldn't just show up because they would need to get a ride. It was not the kind of place where people just drop by. I was curious though, so I wanted to check it out. I tiptoed to the front door and peeked through the window. The curtains were in the way though, and I didn't want to risk being seen, so I moved back. Then I remembered the Ring camera and pulled up the feed. There, standing under the porch light, was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She was alone, or so it seemed, and looked harmless standing there. She was wearing a light jacket and had her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Despite the strangeness, there was something that seemed genuine about her. I know how that sounds now, but remember that I was young back then. It's not usually somebody like that you think about when they teach you about stranger danger. I know that opening the door to a stranger at night isn't the smartest thing to do. Yeah, that's what I did. I unlocked it and opened it just enough to speak through the gap. She seemed relieved when I cracked the door open. Her voice was calm, and she quickly explained herself. "Hi, sorry to bother you so late. My car just died down the road and my phone's battery is dead. Could I use your phone to call for help?" the woman said. I thought that made sense, but I was still not that comfortable. I glanced over her shoulder to see if I could spot the car she mentioned. There was a dark-colored car parked at an awkward angle. It was partially hidden by the shadows of the trees lining our driveway. It was about 40 feet away from our front door. She noticed me looking and turned slightly to glance back at it. "It's just there," she said, pointing. "I really wouldn't bother you if it wasn't an emergency," she added. I was torn. On one hand, she seemed genuine, stranded, and in need of help. But something inside me knew that I shouldn't do it while I was home alone. Come to think of it, what kind of grown person would do that with a kid alone? She didn't even ask to talk to my parents, but I didn't think of that at the time. I was about to say something when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye, a subtle shift in the car's dark interior. It was dark, but I was pretty sure there was a movement in there. I thought I saw somebody ducking down, likely trying not to be seen. Alarm bells went off in my head. "Is someone with you?" I asked. My voice cracked a little. The woman's face changed just slightly, a flicker of something like panic, but she regained her composure. "No, it's just me." "Why do you ask?" Her response was shaky, her smile forced. I took a step back, keeping the door partially open. "I thought I saw something move in your car," I said cautiously. "Really?" I should have slammed the door right there and locked it as fast as I could, but I didn't. She laughed nervously. Oh, it must have just been a reflection or something. But her explanation didn't convince me. I didn't want to argue, so I simply nodded. No problem. My phone's in the other room. I'll get it, I said. She smiled again, a bit too eagerly. That'd be great. Thank you, but her eyes darted past me towards the interior of the house. I closed the door firmly, locked it, and quickly walked away to find the phone, not to give it to her but to call for help. When I got it, I called my parents, who were only about 20 minutes away in one of the towns. As soon as I got halfway through the story, my parents were on their way back. That was a long time to wait, and the police were likely to take just as long. I didn't bother calling them, but I would later learn that my parents did. I never went back out to the door, but I was watching on the camera. The woman waited for about 5 minutes. Then I saw her walk out of frame. I waited for a few minutes and then went to the front window and looked out. I couldn't believe my eyes when I noticed that the car was gone. That must have meant that she was lying all along. From that moment on, I was terrified that somebody was going to break into the house. I didn't know where the car was, so for all I knew, it was around the corner somewhere. I hid in a closet until my parents got home. Minutes after that, a police car rolled into the driveway. My dad showed them the ring footage, and they stayed for a bit, looking around, but took off without much hope of a real resolution. For me, it was basically confirmed already that the woman was up to something bad for sure. She was definitely a liar, and there was probably somebody else in that car. She was using her innocent look to try to trick me, and it almost worked. I made a lot of mistakes that night, but I was smart enough to call for help before it was too late. Story 2. I used to live in an apartment in a 2-story building. It reminded me a bit of one of those old motels that you see in the movies, the parking lot right in the middle, sort of a horseshoe-shaped layout. Our door led right outside, even though we were on the 2nd floor. There was no hallway, just a metal staircase that made a very distinct noise when you walked up. It was like it belonged in a factory or warehouse and had a real industrial feel. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough for me and my roommate Kevin. We had met online when the room opened up, but we became friends quickly. We had a lot of shared interests, and video games were a big one, so that was enough for us to bond over. Our place was right in the downtown part of our city. Like most major cities, there was some crime. You would often see sketchy-looking people around. At the time when this happened, Kevin and I had only been living together for just over a year. He had a job that required him to travel a lot, so I would often have the place to myself for a few days here and there, or even a whole week sometimes. This was one of those occasions, so I had the place to myself. That particular night, I decided to relax and play some games in the living room. At around midnight, I heard footsteps coming up that staircase outside. They were loud as always, so they were hard to ignore. Then came a knock at the door. Considering the time, I thought maybe Kevin had come back early. He had a habit of changing plans last minute and not telling me until he showed up. He was due back the next day, so it wouldn't have been such a stretch. I paused the game, got up, and walked over to the door. The peephole showed a man that I didn't recognize. He looked rough, with a worn jacket and a fidgety demeanor that made me cautious immediately. I hadn't opened the door yet, just watched him through the tiny, distorted view. I decided against opening the door fully. Instead, I just opened it a crack and left the chain lock on, just enough to speak through, not enough to let him in. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice friendly. The man shifted his weight from one foot to another, looking nervous, or maybe it was just my own nerves reflecting back at me. "I need to use your bathroom," he said quickly, almost too quickly. His eyes darted around, not quite meeting mine. Something about the way he said that didn't sit right with me. No polite introduction, no explanation of why he couldn't go somewhere else, not to mention his overall demeanor. I didn't say anything for a moment, my hands still on the doorknob, and then my senses kicked in. Without saying another word, I shut the door firmly and twisted the lock into place. I didn't even want to give him a chance to force his way in. I stepped back, my heart racing a bit, and I listened as his footsteps lingered. There was no sound of him descending the stairs, so I knew he was still there on the other side of the door, waiting. I wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but I didn't want to find out. The next 10 minutes felt much longer than they should have. There was a silence from the other side of the door, but I knew he was still there. Every little noise from outside, every distant car horn or barking dog, made me jump. I was afraid that he was going to try to come through the window or something. Then, finally, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of those same metal stairs. The man was going back down, and I watched through the peephole until I saw him vanish from view. I didn't feel safe until I double-checked every lock in the apartment. I even put a chair against the door for good measure. The whole experience shook me, not just because of the guy at the door, but because of how easily things could have gone wrong if I hadn't been cautious. For the rest of the night, I didn't play any more games. Instead, I just sat there with a baseball bat that I found in Kevin's room, not that I knew how to use it. I didn't sleep much, if at all. I told Kevin the whole story when he got back the next day. He was as surprised as I was, and we agreed to be even more careful in the future. To this day, I wonder what that guy's real intentions were. Maybe he really did just need a bathroom. But something in my gut tells me that it was more than that, and I was lucky to have trusted my instincts. Story 3. I was working a late shift at a 24-hour convenience store. The graveyard shift wasn't always as bad as it sounds. It was mostly quiet, with the occasional night owl or trucker stopping by for coffee or snacks. The store was located on a relatively busy road, but it was still the outskirts of town, so it could get pretty lonely. The store itself was a typical setup: bright fluorescent lights, aisles of groceries, and a small counter at the front where I spent most of my time. It was about 2 a.m. when a man walked in. He seemed normal enough at first glance, just another customer in need of something to keep him awake. He wandered around the aisles for a bit, picking up a few items here and there. It wasn't until he approached the counter that I got a better look at him. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked a little too jittery for my liking. He set his items down: a pack of gum, an energy drink, and some chips, nothing out of the ordinary. I started ringing him up, trying to be polite but keeping my guard up. "How's your night going?" I asked, mostly out of habit. He glanced at me, his expression hard to read. "It's been a long one," he replied, his voice low and rough. I nodded, not wanting to push the conversation any further. I finished ringing up his items, and he handed me a crumpled bill. As I was making change, I noticed him looking around the store, his eyes darting to the corners and the security cameras. Something about the way he was acting made me uneasy. He took his change and his bag of items, but instead of leaving, he just stood there, staring at me. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. "Is there anything else you need?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring. Then he leaned in a bit closer to the counter, his eyes narrowing. "You alone here?" he asked, his tone too casual to be innocent. My heart skipped a beat. The truth was I was alone, but there was no way I was going to tell him that. "No," I said quickly, trying to sound confident. "My coworker is in the back." He didn't seem convinced. "Oh yeah? Maybe I should meet them," he said, taking a step closer. I forced a laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "They're busy with inventory. Can't leave the back room right now." He stared at me for another long moment, then finally he nodded. "All right then," he said, his voice still low. "Have a good night." He turned and walked out of the store, but I didn't relax until I saw him get into a beat-up car and drive away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I quickly locked the front door and called my manager, explaining what had happened. They agreed that it was better to be safe than sorry and told me to keep the door locked for the rest of my shift. The rest of the night was a blur of nervous glances at the door and checking the security cameras. Every little noise made me jump. When my shift finally ended, I was more than ready to go home. The encounter with that man stayed with me for a long time, a reminder of how vulnerable you can feel when you're alone, even in a place that's supposed to be safe. It made me a lot more cautious and aware of my surroundings, especially during those late-night shifts. I never saw the man again, and part of me is grateful for that. But every now and then I can't help but wonder what his real intentions were and how differently that night could have ended if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Story 4. I was house sitting for my aunt and uncle while they were on vacation. They lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, the kind where people actually know their neighbors and kids play in the streets. It was a pretty uneventful week, mostly just feeding their dog and making sure the plants didn't die. I was in college at the time, so the peace and quiet were a nice break from the hectic campus life. One night I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a strange noise from the backyard. It was a soft thud, followed by what sounded like a low muttering. At first I thought it might just be the wind or maybe an animal, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It definitely wasn't the wind. I paused the TV and sat still, listening intently. The dog, a small terrier, had started growling softly, his ears perked up. That was enough to convince me that something was off. I got up and walked to the back door, peeking through the curtains. The backyard was dimly lit by a single porch light, casting long shadows across the lawn. I couldn't see anything unusual at first, but then I noticed movement near the back fence. It was subtle, a dark figure shifting in the shadows. My heart started pounding. I knew I should call the police, but for some reason I hesitated. Maybe it was just a neighbor's cat or something. I tried to convince myself. I decided to investigate further, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I stepped outside, the dog following close behind me, still growling. The night air was cool, and the sounds of crickets filled the silence. I shone the flashlight towards the back fence, and that's when I saw him. A man, dressed in dark clothes, was crouched down, fiddling with something on the ground. He looked up, and for a moment our eyes met. He froze, and so did I. "What are you doing?" I managed to shout, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood up slowly and started walking towards me. Panic surged through me, and I backed up, almost tripping over the dog. I could see his face now, rough and unshaven, with a menacing look in his eyes. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. By the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no sign of him. The officer told me it was probably just a vagrant or someone trying to break in, but his words didn't do much to calm my nerves. I stayed up the rest of the night, unable to shake the image of the man's face and the way he had looked at me. My aunt and uncle were horrified when they heard what had happened. They installed new security cameras and a better fence, but it took me a long time to feel safe again, even in my own place. That night taught me to always trust my instincts and to never hesitate when it comes to my safety. The world can be a scary place, and you never know what kind of danger might be lurking just outside your door. Story 5. This story isn't mine, but something that happened to somebody that I was classmates with. Some of the details mentioned below I received from her friends, and some were from an interview she gave to a local daily. This incident happened a few years ago when I was in college pursuing my master's degree. There was this group of friends, 3 boys and a girl, and they were quite close. We actually had a common class in the previous semester, and that's how I knew them. I don't think I ever talked to the guys, but the girl, I'll call her Lizzie, seemed quite friendly, and we did exchange smiles occasionally. On this particular day after the classes at about 5 in the evening, the group drove over their car to the nearby store. The store was about a 5-minute drive from the college. There was also a cafe nearby and a food truck too, so it was a common hangout for college kids. The boy who was driving parked the car on the road and the boys got out to grab something quickly. Lizzie, for some reason, chose not to get out of the car. Maybe because the boys made it clear that they were going to make the trip quick, Lizzie just sat in the back seat scrolling her phone. She was quite oblivious to her surroundings, focusing on the phone when all of a sudden she heard the car's engine start and then slowly move forward. She looked ahead and to her surprise, it wasn't her friend who was driving, it was a complete stranger. That's when she started to panic and screamed her lungs out. Her friends and other people noticed, so they too started screaming for the man to stop the car. One of Lizzie's friends even chased after them, but the driver just increased the speed and began driving recklessly on the highway. Lizzie tried to open the doors and windows, but the guy had instantly locked them as soon as he entered. So she tried kicking the seat and hitting him, but he just pushed her to the back. He was a 6 tall, well-built guy. She then realized that she had her phone in her hands, so she quickly tried calling the police, but he snatched her phone from her. She might have tried screaming and even begging for him to let her out, but he didn't. When they entered a secluded road, she had kind of lost hope of getting out alive, so she just closed her eyes and began praying to God for help. Just then, as if God answered her prayers, she saw flashing lights behind her, tailing the car. The man tried to drive faster to lose them, but the patrol vehicle managed to overtake the car and bring them to a halt. As soon as the car came to a stop, the driver tried running away, but he was caught. The police helped Lizzie out of the car. She was in shock and trembling with fear. She didn't know what evil intentions this man had for trying to kidnap her. Fortunately, While they were on the highway speeding away, a traffic cop had seen the car driving recklessly and noticed a woman inside hitting the window. He had a gut feeling that there was somebody in trouble, so he quickly called a patrol vehicle in the vicinity to tail the car. That quick action saved Lizzie. As for how the car was stolen, Lizzie's friend who drove had forgotten to lock the car's door and also remove the keys. Maybe they thought it would be quick. The police interrogated the man, and he said he didn't realize that there was somebody in the back seat. To Lizzie sitting behind the driver's seat, his initial plan was to steal the car. But when he saw that there was a girl in the back, he wanted to desert it in a secluded place. This is hard to believe, but that was his version, and I don't know if he was lying or later confessed the truth. But surely he didn't plan to just leave her in a secluded place. If he planned to let her out, then he might have done that beforehand. Fortunately, she was saved, but the fact that she was kidnapped in daylight at a public spot is just shocking. One of my friends was also at that spot when this incident occurred. Everyone seemed shocked and in distress. The trauma of escaping her kidnapping kind of took a toll on Lizzie, who I never saw after this incident. I got to know from her classmates that she decided to go back to her hometown and only come back for the exams. The boys did stick around, but they definitely weren't their usual selves like before. Before this, they were always cracking jokes and laughing hysterically. Afterwards, they often seemed quiet and distant, like they missed their friend and kind of blamed themselves for it. We never got to know what happened to the man, but I read an article in the newspaper covering the story. It said that he had been arrested previously for stealing things and also for robbing a house. So when he saw the new car, he must have decided to steal it. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but it could have been worse if the guy hadn't been arrested. This incident did teach me that really weird and terrifying things may happen to normal people we know or even to us, which might transform our ordinary day into something of a nightmare. So let's just be cautious of our surroundings and definitely be safe. Story 6. After my first marriage ended, I was alone for a while. I moved back to my hometown and got a one-bedroom apartment in my old neighborhood. My parents were only 15 minutes away, and I was able to reconnect with some of my old friends. After about a year of that, I was ready to start dating again. That was when I started to get into online dating. I had a few all-right meetups during the first 6 months or so, but then one night I matched with a woman named Karen. She was a few years younger than me. I was 32 and I think she was 28. She had dark hair and wore glasses. She was pretty but also demure. She didn't fully smile in any of her pictures, and I got the idea she was quiet just by looking at her pictures. We chatted for a bit and then decided to meet up for drinks. I took an Uber to the bar and grabbed a table off to the side, then texted her. I sat there kind of nervous for a while, but she arrived within only a few minutes, and she looked just like her pictures. She was nice enough at first, but I would be lying if I said I saw any future with her. I was thinking that we would just have a few drinks and then call it a night. After a while, though, I was a little drunk and feeling brave. It was getting late and I decided to take a chance and ask her, "Would you like to come to my place?" Karen smiled and shook her head. "No, but you can come over to my house if you want," she offered. I was surprised but agreed to go. I paid the bill and we left the bar. I thought we were going to take an Uber, but then Karen told me that she had a car. There was a parking lot down the street, so we walked there. Her car was actually a pickup truck that looked out of place for a girl like her. I got in anyway, and she started driving. I still didn't even know where we were going specifically. After about half an hour, I noticed we were out in the country. I started to feel uneasy and I asked her, "Where do you live?" She replied, "It's just a little farther." We were still talking and having a good time, but we were really out in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea how I was going to get home because an Uber would be so expensive. Finally, we arrived at an old house in an isolated spot. As we pulled into the long driveway, I got a closer look at the place. It looked run down, but I saw lights on inside. She told me she lived alone, so I figured she left the lights on for whatever reason. For a split second, though, I thought I saw somebody walk by one of the windows, but it was so fast that I wasn't sure. I asked Karen if there was anybody else there, but she told me no. I actually believed her. When the car stopped out front, Karen smiled at me and said, "We're here." We got out of the car and started walking towards the house. As we made our way up the path, I noticed how weird the whole thing was. I had just met this person online, and there I was in this remote spot with her. She was basically a perfect stranger, and I hardly knew her. Like I said earlier, I was a bit tipsy from the drinks, so maybe not thinking straight. The place looked neglected, almost abandoned, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. It didn't seem like the kind of place where a cute young woman would live by herself, but Karen seemed unfazed, leading the way confidently. I followed her. When we reached the front door, she stopped, opened it, and gestured for me to enter. I hesitated but told myself I was overreacting. Inside, the lights were already on and it smelled musty. I glanced around, expecting to see somebody, but the place seemed empty. Karen took off her shoes, and as soon as we got in, she disappeared down the hall. I was left standing in the doorway. As each minute went by, I was feeling more and more uncomfortable. I had ignored a lot of red flags leading up to this point, and I was really uncomfortable with where I was. I decided to leave right away without saying anything. I turned around and walked out the front door. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard footsteps from the house. The scariest part was that it sounded like more than one person. Then Karen called after me. She was no longer quiet or soft-spoken. She screamed, "Where are you going?" I didn't look back. I just ran down the path. The moon was barely bright enough to see. I got back to the truck and hid behind it to catch my breath. From there I could see Karen's front door was wide open. I saw a second person standing there. They had their back to me, but I saw Karen speaking to them in a hurry. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I started running again and disappeared into the woods near her house. I kept running through the woods, and after a while I found a clearing and followed a road out. I was lucky that another car came by and I flagged them down for help. I got a ride back into the city and called another Uber back to my apartment. The next day I texted Karen and asked her what was going on, but she didn't respond. Then I blocked her number. After that, I thought it over and convinced myself that the whole thing was a setup. Maybe Karen wasn't who she said she was, or maybe she was planning to rob me or do worse. Whatever it was, I had a close call, but I'm thankful I trusted my instincts and got out when I did. I never heard from Karen again. I don't know what was happening in that house or who was involved, but I'm glad I left and never found out. Now, I don't go on dates with strangers without doing my research first. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life. Story 7. This story was shared with me by a coworker who experienced it firsthand. I'll call her Jenny. Jenny and I worked together in an office downtown. She was a diligent worker and generally very cheerful. This incident happened a few years before I met her, but it left a lasting impression on her. Jenny had always been an avid runner. She often went for jogs in the early mornings before work. It was her routine to run through the park near her apartment. The park was usually empty at that hour, with only a few people walking their dogs or other joggers like her. One morning, Jenny set out for her usual run. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a dim light across the park. As she was running, she noticed a man sitting on one of the park benches. He seemed to be in his late 30s or early 40s, and he was staring at her as she ran past. Jenny didn't think much of it at first. She was used to seeing people in the park and usually just gave them a nod or a quick smile. But something about this man made her uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. She continued her run, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. She took her usual path, which looped around the park and would eventually bring her back to where she started. As she was nearing the end of her run, she saw the man again. This time he was standing near the path, watching her intently. Jenny's heart started to race. She told herself that she was overreacting, that it was just a coincidence that he was there. But her instincts were telling her otherwise. She decided to cut her run short and head straight home. As she picked up her pace, she glanced back and saw the man following her. He was walking quickly, trying to keep up with her. Jenny's unease turned to fear. She sprinted the rest of the way out of the park and onto the street, hoping to lose him. When she reached her apartment building, she quickly entered and locked the door behind her. She ran up the stairs to her apartment and locked herself inside, her heart pounding. She looked out the window and saw the man standing across the street, staring up at her building. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes before finally walking away. Jenny didn't go for a run for the next few days, still shaken by the encounter. She reported the incident to the police, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. A few days later, Jenny decided to go for a run again, but this time she brought her phone with her and took a different route. She couldn't let fear control her life, but she also knew she had to be cautious. Thankfully, she never saw the man again, but the experience left her wary. She changed her running routine and started going to a nearby gym instead. The incident made her realize how vulnerable she could be, even in a place she considered safe. Story 8. This story is from my cousin Mark, who went on a camping trip with his friends a few years ago. Mark is an adventurous guy who loves the outdoors. He and his friends often went on camping and hiking trips to explore new places. On this particular trip, they decided to camp in a remote area of the forest, far away from any towns or other campers. They arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, set up their tents, and started a campfire. The evening was filled with laughter, stories, and the usual camping activities. As night fell, they decided to go for a walk in the forest. The moon was bright enough to light their way, and they thought it would be a fun adventure. As they walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night became more pronounced. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot created an eerie atmosphere. They were enjoying the walk, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. After about an hour, they decided to head back to the campsite. As they turned around, Mark saw a figure standing in the distance. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. He pointed it out to his friends, and they all stopped, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. Feeling uneasy, they decided to pick up the pace and head back to their campsite. As they walked, they kept looking back to see if the figure was following them, but it seemed to have disappeared. When they finally reached their campsite, they were relieved to see the fire still burning brightly. They sat down and tried to shake off the eerie feeling. Later that night, as they were sitting around the campfire, they heard footsteps approaching. They looked around but couldn't see anyone. The footsteps grew louder, circling their campsite. Mark and his friends grabbed their flashlights and tried to see who or what was out there, but they saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, out of nowhere, a loud, blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It sounded like a woman in distress, but it was so loud and unnatural that it sent chills down their spines. They jumped up, frantically looking around, but still they saw nothing. The scream echoed through the forest, and then there was silence again. Terrified, they decided to stay up for the rest of the night, keeping watch. They sat around the fire, clutching their flashlights and trying to stay alert. As the hours passed, they didn't hear or see anything else. When the first light of dawn broke, they quickly packed up their gear and left the campsite. They never figured out who or what was responsible for the footsteps and the scream. It remained a mystery, and the experience left them all deeply shaken. Mark and his friends still go camping, but they are much more cautious now. They stick to more populated areas and always make sure they are prepared for anything. That night in the forest taught them to respect the unknown and to never let their guard down, no matter how safe they might feel. Story 9. I lived in an apartment for about 5 years. For the most part, I had pretty good neighbors. I was in a one-bedroom place that was relatively small but good for me. I lived there alone for the most part. I had a girlfriend for a while who would stay over, but she lived somewhere else. The apartment was on the bottom floor, and I had neighbors above me and next to me. They were usually pretty quiet, and I liked where I lived. But one time, something scary happened. I remember it was one day after I had gotten off work, and I was just relaxing in my place. I was on my couch and watching TV. It was still daylight out, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The apartment had a back door that led to a small patio, and I had it open at the time. I could see outside from the couch, and I saw a man walk by. I didn't think anything of it at the time because it wasn't unusual for people to walk around the complex. But then the guy came back and walked right up to my back door. I thought maybe he was a maintenance worker or something, so I got up and went over to see what he wanted. When I got to the door, he was standing right outside, and I saw that he had a knife in his hand. My heart sank, and I didn't know what to do. The guy then forced his way inside and told me to sit down. I did as he said, and he asked me if I had any money. I told him that I didn't have any cash, just a credit card. He then told me to give him my wallet. I reached over and got it from the counter and handed it to him. He took the wallet and looked through it, but didn't find any cash. The guy then got really mad and started yelling at me. I told him that I could go to the bank and get money if he wanted. Surprisingly, he agreed to this and told me to get up. I was really scared at this point and didn't know what to do. I walked over to the door, and he followed me with the knife still in his hand. I went outside, and he walked right behind me. As we got to the parking lot, I saw my car and started walking towards it. I was hoping that someone would see us and call the police, but nobody was around. When we got to the car, the guy told me to get in the driver's seat, and he got in the passenger seat. I started the car and began driving to the bank. It was only a few minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. The guy kept the knife pointed at me the whole time and told me not to do anything stupid. When we got to the bank, I parked the car, and the guy told me to go inside and withdraw the money. I asked him how much he wanted, and he said $500. I went inside the bank, and as soon as I got to the counter, I told the teller that I was being robbed. They called the police immediately, and within a couple of minutes they arrived and arrested the guy. I was so relieved that it was over, and I couldn't believe that I had made it out safely. After that incident, I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could. I didn't feel safe living there anymore, and I didn't want to take any chances. I found a new place in a different part of town, and I've been living there ever since. Story 10. Something really weird happened to me last summer. I live alone in a house that's somewhat out in the country. My house is on a busier road, but I have a large yard, so it doesn't bother me that much because my house is a ways from the road, and I have a longer driveway. My property is 7 acres in total. Next to my driveway, I have my mailbox and some trees planted alongside the road for privacy. There is, however, a good amount of grass. One morning I got up and went outside and noticed something strange. Someone had parked their car in my front yard. I walked out to examine it and saw that it was a car for sale. They had parked their car at the end of my yard, about 50 feet from the driveway, facing the road so anybody driving by would see it. The car looked like a red 2002 Dodge Neon with a big sign that said for sale. There was a price and a phone number to call. Apparently, somebody thought it was okay to just park their car in my yard to try to sell it. This rubbed me the wrong way. I took out my phone and dialed the number on the sign. A man picked up and I asked him if he was the one selling the Neon. He said that he was, and I told him that he had parked it in my front yard. Then I told him that I didn't want him parking there and asked him to move it. He claimed that his friend told him he knew me and it was all right. When I asked him the friend's name, he said John Newman. Well, I didn't know anybody named John Newman and figured that this guy was just making it up on the spot. I told him to move the car as soon as possible. He said that he would, and then he hung up on me. I didn't know who this guy was or why he parked his car there. For the rest of the day, he did not come by to move it at all. I even checked outside before I went to bed that night. He still hadn't moved it. I guessed that I would call him the next day and ask him again. The next morning, I got up and went outside at about 7 a.m. to check, and the car was still there. I decided to give the guy another call and reminded him to move the car. He said he would take care of it soon. However, by the time it was noon, the car still hadn't been moved. I was really frustrated by then. Later that day, as I was out and about, I decided to do some cleaning in the car. As I was vacuuming the seat, something weird happened. Well, the seat sort of moved. I was getting into the crevice at the bottom part, and the part that you actually sit on moved. I felt around and pulled on it. Then the entire seat lifted up, revealing a secret compartment. Inside there was a bunch of cash. I couldn't believe my eyes. I really didn't know what was going on. I took the money and then went inside my house. There was a bunch of $20 bills. I carefully counted the bills, my heart racing with excitement and confusion. There had to be at least a few $1,000s here. I couldn't understand why someone would hide such a large sum of money in their car seat. Was it connected to the guy trying to sell the car in my yard? As I pondered over the situation, I decided to call the police. It seemed like the right thing to do, given the circumstances. Within an hour, an officer arrived at my doorstep. I explained everything from the mysterious car parked in my yard to the discovery of the hidden cash. The officer inspected the car thoroughly and ran a check on the vehicle's registration. It turned out that the car had been reported stolen a few weeks ago from a nearby town. The officer speculated that whoever stole the car might have hidden the cash in the seat compartment to avoid detection. They thanked me for reporting the find and assured me that they would investigate further. A few days later, I received a call from the police informing me that they had apprehended the person who had stolen the car. They were also able to return the cash to its rightful owner, who had reported it missing along with the car. Reflecting on the bizarre events, I realized that sometimes strange occurrences can lead to unexpected outcomes. I also learned the importance of trusting my instincts and taking action when something doesn't seem right. As for the guy trying to sell the car in my yard, he never showed up to move it. I assumed he must have heard about the police involvement and decided to abandon his attempt to sell the stolen vehicle. The whole experience left me with a mix of relief and curiosity about what other surprises my quiet country life might hold.